Fields can read data from a large number of different objects, including objects made of points, polygons, and particles. Among them are mesh objects, generated objects, editable and procedural splines, standard particles, and thinking particles. In this video, we will see how the point object, the spline object, and the particle object fields work. When referring to point objects in Cinema 4D, we're actually talking about any type of object that generates geometry. So, any of the primitives, excluding the null, because the null doesn't produce any geometry. So, disks, torusi, toruses, whatever. Any kind of generated object. So I can take some text and add an extrude, make it a child, and this is a point object. So let me delete this plane effector and start again. So we have our cloner object, and I'm going to go here and add a plane effector. Fantastic. And what I'm going to do to make it easier to see is turn off any kind of position, scale, and rotation, and we're going to play with the colors. So let's go to the fall off, and for simplicity's sake, we're going to start with a sphere. Now, just to make the sphere a bit less irritating, I'm going to add a display tag and set my view to be lines, wireframe. That's fantastic. And then just select the sphere, go to the basic, and let's add a color. So automatic white would do. Fantastic, and there we go. In the field list now, we're going to drop the sphere, and you can see we get that little indicator, and here it is. Now, the sphere is under the point object mode. You can see the icon is the same here. And any object that has geometry, if you drop it in a field list, it will give you this icon. Now, there's another way if you want to link it, and that will be the following. Let's assume that we didn't have this, and I had a point object which is empty. When I click it, it will ask me, you can see the little question mark on the cursor. So now I can go and select the object. So it's exactly the same thing. Now let's go and see what this did. I'm going to turn off the values and turn on the colors. And let's zoom in here and take a closer look. Now when I select the point object field and go to the layer, which is the most important of all the tabs, you will see that we have the modes, the radius, and the clip to shape. 3 modes: point, surface, and volume. Points. What it will do, based on this radius, it's going to actually use some sort of spherical field around each point of the mesh. So if I take this sphere and start moving it around, you will see that the values change based on which points are closer to our clones. So that's the actual functionality. Let's go and change a few things. We can extend the radius and make it larger or smaller. If it's under a certain threshold, nothing will be selected because the distance of each and every one of the clones is further than 0 centimeters from the point. Excellent. The clip to shape, which doesn't do anything in this case, I need to go to remapping. Let's set the min to 50%. So you can see that outside the influence of every little sphere, this becomes the 0 value, whereas right on the point is the 1 value. And because the 0 value represents 50% of the color, that's what we see here. But if I go to the layer tab and clip to shape, you will see that everything outside the influence of the 31 centimeter radius is clipped and won't receive a value. So that's how this is used. So let me go and reduce this ever so slightly. I'm going to leave it on so we can see the differences when I change the modes anyway. So this is it. This is the points mode. Excellent. Now let's change mode and go to surface mode. So the surface mode is not going to sample the points. It's actually going to sample the surface. So we get this continuous value from the surface of the object. It's sampling everywhere a polygon exists. So if I rotate it this way, you'll see nothing really changes, only a few flickers, because the sphere has a constant radius. But if I use something else, for example, I can create a cube. And what I'm going to do is click on this and press Command to make a copy and drag it on there. And in my plane effector field list, I'm going to replace the sphere, with the cube. You do that by dragging the cube over here until you see a finger and release, and now the cube is actually the source for that point object. So now, since it's set to surface, I can go and do certain things, and you can see we get this nice two-dimensional projection of a square on our values in our clones. Fantastic. Undo, and let me just go again and replace that with this and delete the cube, or just hide it. Maybe we'll use it a bit later on. So the surface mode, we have the radius again, and then we have the restriction mode. So none means that this 25 centimeter radius, it's 25 outwards and 25 inwards. If we want to restrict the values only to the inner part of our surface or the outer part, we use one of these. So inside will only transfer values on the clones or polygons or vertex maps inside the object, and outside we do exactly the opposite, and the clip to shape will actually clip it as we would expect it to. So the last of all the modes is the volume, and the volume works pretty much in a binary fashion. It will just add the maximum value in all the clones that reside within the volume of an object, and the clip to shape, it will only do this. Okay, but we don't have a radius value. So this is just to transfer the value to all the clones that are inside the volume of our object. And that pretty much summarizes the point object. Similarly to point objects, when we are referring to spline objects, we mean anything from editable splines, procedural splines, and generated splines, and whatnot. So let's go to our cloner and add a plane effector. And the way we add them to the list is precisely the same. What I'm going to do, let me grab a circle. And I'm going to set it on the XZ axis. And what I'm going to do is make it slightly smaller. Fantastic. Now, because the clones reside exactly where the circle is, let me press H here. The circle is over here. In case you missed it, there it is. And we can't see it, but we know that it's on the same plane as our clones. So let's turn on the plane effector and drag the circle in here, and we get a spline object. And again, if I didn't have a spline object here, I'm going to delete this. You create a spline object, and you get that little question mark, and you click on your spline object, and there it goes. Great. So let me turn on the colorization. I'm going to turn on the value so you can see what's going on here. So this creates this really odd effect, and a lot of people get confused by this, and they usually ask what's going on. And sometimes they sing it, and I'm not a good singer, so I won't even attempt. So let's go to our plane effector, select the spline, go to the layer, and let me just close this for a second. And what we have here is spline shape is a curve or a mask. Okay, so these are the two shapes that are going to be taken into account. And then we have the distance mode, which is along, radius, and along and radius. Fantastic. So we have all the settings down here. Let's go and check out the spline shape first of all. So when we're talking about a curve, and I think in order to get this a bit clearer, what I'm going to do is go and add a color. So I'll make it white so we can see the circle down here. And even better, I'm going to make it editable. Select it, go to the object, and open the spline. So we have a definite beginning of the spline, and it goes all the way around, and an ending of the spline. So how is this affecting what we have here? Well, the way the values are generated in this particular situation is the following. Just in case you didn't know, a spline, when we go to the point mode and select the spline, you can see it's got a gradient from blue to white. And normally this shows the direction of the spline, because splines have a beginning and an end over here. So what is the beginning and what is the end? Well, that's kind of insignificant at this point. But either way, you can see that this is how this whole thing... But this is how splines work. Now, in the context of what we're doing, you can see that on the blue side, we have a maximum value. The way this is evaluated, which is interesting, is depending on how far away each clone is from each segment of the spline. Okay, so we have a spline that has a beginning and an end. And from the beginning to the end, there is a gradient. So let's assume that 1 is here, because we can see it. Everything is going up. 1 is here, and it goes down, 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 and here is 0. This is the spline's gradient, what is called along the spline. So the values are generated along the spline. So all these clones are figuring out how close they are to any part of the spline. So a clone that's over here will be closer to this part. A clone that's over here will be closer to this part. And generally, it's the perpendicular to the tangent, which has a name, which I don't really recall exactly what that name was. Someone told me the other day. Anyhow, go to Google and find it. But based on the value of the gradient of the spline, that's how the values are propagated on the clones. So therefore, what we see here is that any clone which is closer to this point will receive maximum value, and then it's going to go down, 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 and any cloner which is closer to this part of the spline is going to receive the minimum value. So this is the along mode. Fantastic. Now, if you use mask, then we have a totally different situation. I'm going to check out the masks when I'm done with the other modes. So the other one is a radius. So what radius does, it forgets the spline's gradient, so to speak, the beginning and the end. And all it does is create a radius around the spline. And based on that distance, it applies the value to more and more clones, which is very similar to the surface mode of the point object. And of course, we can clip to shape if we have values. There we go. So you can see that working. And that's fantastic. Very, very self-evident. Now, what I do like is the third mode. So the third mode is a combination of the along and the radius. So you get the gradients and you get a radius at the same time. Isn't that fantastic? Look at that. And what some and that's pretty much what is, and that summarizes the distance modes. So now let's go and check out the spline shapes. Now there's a bit of a gotcha here. If you're using mask, you need to change a few things. Number one, the mask projection. So we are trying to project the mask from the top. And currently the default is along the Z, which is that away. And because the circle is lying on the floor, we need to actually project it on the Y. And there you go. Now, this is quite funky, and it's a wrong result. And the reason is, when we use masks, it's mandatory to use a closed spline. So if I go to the circle and close it, now we can actually see what the correct result is. And it asks us if the fall off of the mask is going to be outside or inside, and the distance. So this is masking, but with a gradient, and it's a extremely powerful tool you can use to do all sorts of nice things. And of course, clip to shape does what you would expect it to do. So that's pretty much it. When we are in mask mode, we need to have a closed spline, and we have to select the projection and select the inside or the outside. Now let's go back to our curve so we can check out a few of the along attributes, which apply to the along and radius as well. So first of all, segments per segment or whole spline, and this makes a distinction between if we have a single spline, like in our case here, which is just one spline segment, or if we have multi-segment splines like fonts or other combined splines. And then we have the ranges. So let me just play around with this, and you will see that this just changes the gradient. So it sort of remaps the gradient of the spline. So that's the start, and we have the range end in a similar fashion. So we can control how the spline and in which parts, in which clones, it applies the minimum maximum value. So it's some sort of, let's say, spatial way to create some remapping. And yeah, it's quite powerful. And then we have the offset. So this whole thing can move. And the ramp can change position. And finally, a long curve fall off. And let me just make these the default values again. There you go. And basically, this remaps how that gradient goes from the beginning of the spline to the end of the spline. So if I right-click and say reset, nothing will change because this line represents the original mapping. But now what I can do is, for example, I can command-click to add a point, and then command-click to another point, and command-click to add another point and another point. And basically what I'm doing, I'm changing this gradient's value generation properties based on this spline, which makes it quite interesting if I want to use some of their presets like a sine wave and so forth. So let's go here and increase the parameter, and there you go, we get these nice funky results. And yes, with that we conclude the spline object field. As far as particles go, what we can do is either use our standard particles, so this emitter, or thinking particles, which I'm going to show you in a second. So let me just rewind. I was doing some tests earlier. I've done the setup already for you here. So go to our field list in the plane effector, which only has a color parameter. I'm going to turn on the position just for the fun of it, and just drag the emitter in here. Now if I press play, you will see that the particles are going to force the clones to move up. So let me stop the animation, rewind, select the emitter and drag him back, and press play, and this is what's going to happen. Now, one thing you need to remember about particles is that by default there is no color remap. So if I change this to color, for example, now we can see the colors, and I can turn on or off the remapping. And this has a very small interesting implication. So when the remapping is off in the layer tab, what you can do is go to the color alpha and ask it to use the strength. But this only works if the remapping is off. If the remapping is on, this will be ignored. Now again, if the remapping is on and we have a higher value internally, we can actually go and clip to shape, because all the particle object field is doing, it's actually creating a little sphere fall off, a little spherical fall off around each particle. And that's pretty much it. That's it. These are points, they're moving, and it's like the point mode in the point object field. So let me show you the thinking particle. So let's go and grab this little guy, go here and delete this, and that's fantastic. Now I've done a setup already, so I'm just going to go to my Espresso and enable it, and it's a very simple setup. All I have is the emitter object is driving a p matter waves, and we have 1,000 particles emitted per second. Excellent. And let me activate this. I've put everything on a sphere, which is down there, and I'm going to rewind and press play, and you'll see that nothing happens because I haven't attached anything to it yet. In order to put the thinking particles in here, we don't drag the emitter or something like that. We actually need to go to the simulate and get the actual particle settings, because we are going to grab the group. Now, if you don't know how thinking particles work, I don't care. So there you go. Drag the group in here, the all group, and now rewind, press play, and you can see wherever there's a particle, and the sphere is moving as well. As you can see, it's animating. We have a clone receiving a value. Let's go and change a few things. Let's go again and do a remapping. That's on. Let's do a color remap. Let's set this to a color. Great. So now we're getting a color. Let's make this color red. Make it a bit more interesting, and rewind, press play, and maybe even just set this to emit 10 particles and see if that makes things look better. Come on, particle. Come on, particle. See, the chances of getting a particle to hit the clones is quite slim. But anyhow, you get the idea, and that's just about it. A particle is a point in space. Around it we create a spherical fall off, and we control it using these very, very few parameters here. Clip to shape if we have some sort of minimum remapping, and finally we can use the strength if no other remapping is here. And that concludes the particle object fields.